In a violation of free speech rights, boycotting Israel could become illegal in the US. Proposed legislation in Congress would make it a crime for Americans to boycott Israel, even though that is their constitutionally protected right. For years, Congress has tried to pass laws that would criminalize a boycott of Israel, a top priority for the pro-Israel lobby and major donors to both Democrats and Republicans. These laws would make it illegal for Americans to refuse on political grounds to do business with Israel. They portray the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, or BDS, as a form of anti-Semitism.
There's only one word for it: anti-Semitism. Let us call out the BDS movement for what it is.
Well, I'm not aware of instances in history where there's been an effort through federal legislation to attempt to criminalize political boycotts, which are, of course, constitutionally protected activity.
BDS is a movement calling on supporters to withhold business and cultural interactions with Israel as a non-violent form of pressure to demand Palestinian rights. In early 2019, the previously introduced Combating BDS Act failed to advance in Congress. This bill would have given state and local governments the power to boycott any businesses that boycott Israel. It's also being pushed forward by the pro-Israel lobby and would work to legally strengthen already existing anti-BDS laws at the state level. This comes after Congress failed to pass the Israel Anti-Boycott Act as part of a spending bill before the end of its term in 2018.
There's some powerful forces who just want to throw it into the bill and then force it through without fuller reflection from the body.
Faz Shakir of the American Civil Liberties Union says the proposed legislation violates Americans' constitutionally protected freedom of speech. He believes many members of Congress are unaware of the constitutional implications of this legislation. The Israel Anti-Boycott Act proposes prohibiting boycotts against allies of the United States, specifically calling out boycotts against Israel. For the ACLU, that's a huge issue.
It's trying to chill and stifle speech merely because somebody has a viewpoint that they don't like. And once you go down that road, of course, anybody is susceptible to being targeted for politically unpopular speech.
And Yousef Munir of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights says these laws are specifically directed at groups like his.
The basic point of this act, and the supporters of the legislation are on record saying this, is to combat the Palestinian rights movement here in the United States, which has adopted, of course, boycott, divestment, and sanctions tactics.
BDS has already scored some notable successes. Celebrities like Danny Glover and Naomi Klein have publicly called for boycott of Israel.
I support BDS, and I've supported BDS since 2009. The question is, what do you do when the people under illegal occupation come together and chart out a way for the rest of the world to express their solidarity and support them?
Even church groups like Presbyterian Church USA, the United Church of Christ, and others have announced divestment from Israel. Israel's supporters are seeking to shut down the movement as support grows for citizen action like BDS. Today, 26 states have passed anti-BDS laws, with 13 additional states considering similar measures as well. But in two separate court cases, federal judges in Kansas and Arizona ruled that state laws punishing individuals or companies for partaking in BDS were unconstitutional and violated free speech rights. Meanwhile, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act would force the U.S. Department of Education to treat criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic harassment. In other words, a violation of the Civil Rights Act.
The problem of legislating on it is you're casting too wide a net and you're suggesting activity is anti-Semitic that really isn't anti-Semitism. It's merely a difference of a point of view on a policy area.
This would effectively stifle the speech of Palestinian rights advocacy groups like Munir's organization, and ironically would use anti-Semitism as grounds to silence even Jewish critics of Israel, like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. Here's Jewish academic Judith Butler of Jewish Voice for Peace on BDS.
Support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is just that it is a support for a social justice movement and that it does not imply anti-Semitism.
But I think because, the state of Israel has also gone to great lengths to conflate Judaism and Zionism, there is an understanding in our discourse that somehow these things are more tied than they are in reality.
The First Amendment prevents Congress from making laws that limit free speech. And the ACLU has publicly criticized these pieces of legislation for undermining constitutional values.
The legal fight is, of course, over whether you can impose a criminal fine or a civil fine merely because somebody has a viewpoint that you don't like. And the answer on that is obviously you cannot.
So what happens if these pieces of legislation are passed and become law? Let's start with the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. This law is actually an amendment of the 1979 Export Administration Act, which prohibited U.S. citizens and companies from boycotting friendly nations. U.S. citizens would also be unable to request any information about companies that conduct business relations with Israel, and wouldn't even be allowed to notify the UN if it's unknowingly doing business with Israel.
So the legal consequences are broad. It could be really anything. The things that I fear here is that a federal government passes Anti-Israel Boycott Act, and what may happen is that federal prosecutors throughout America now have new tools at their disposal to target protesters on this issue.
Under this proposed law, both individuals and companies could face financial penalties for supporting EU or UN-backed boycotts of Israel, Israeli companies, and specifically those in the occupied West Bank.
The point here is to intimidate rights activists for engaging in constitutionally protected activity by threatening them with the specter of criminalization and steep fines.
Violations of the law could see U.S. citizens paying up to $250,000 in civil penalties. Willful violations of the law could see citizens fined up to $1 million. And then there's the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which the ACLU and other activist organizations have issued statements opposing.
This is legislation that would actually call on the Department of Education to adopt a particular definition of anti-Semitism or a particular understanding of anti-Semitism, which it should take into consideration as it looks at civil rights discrimination complaints.
This bill would work to silence critics and criticism of Israel in schools, colleges, and universities. And institutions of learning would also work to ensure that their campuses are spaces where criticism of Israel cannot occur, violating their free speech rights to avoid investigations by the Department of Education.
So a student protester who's on a listserv having a debate about Palestinian issues could easily be castigated for having engaged in anti-Semitism and then fear the wrath of a federal agency.
This could result in numerous lawsuits and court cases in which activists and educational institutions sue the government for violations of their free speech and civil rights.
And so what gets unleashed here is potentially prosecutors who use this power in very unfortunate ways. But the other ramification, as you well know, is that culturally it suggests something to all Americans about what will not be tolerated. And that is, of course, this chilling of speech that we worry gravely about.
But despite the possibility of these pieces of legislation becoming law, 2 U.S. Congresswomen have stated their support for BDS. Ilhan Omar of Minnesota and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan have come out in support of BDS. Tlaib is saying she'll lead a congressional delegation to the occupied West Bank in 2019, and that would be a first. Menayer says this is a sign of changing times.
When you look at public opinion, seeing a shift on this issue as well, and primarily the Republican base of white evangelicals being hyper-supportive of Israel. In the base of the Democratic Party in particular, millennials and people of color being much, much more critical of Israeli policy and supportive of the rights of Palestinians.
But Menayer is still concerned about the legislation potentially being passed and what that will mean for free speech and organizing around Palestine.
For vulnerable communities, including people who are working on Palestinian rights work, they have even more reason to be concerned about the way in which this would be enforced, very much for the purpose of intimidating them and marginalizing them.
Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you hit that subscribe button when you get a chance. Were you aware of all the different laws and bills that are fighting BDS? Let us know in the comments.